Good afternoon, everyone. Good to have you here. Thanks for turning out. For those of you who are watching on computer screens around campus and around the state at Mizzou Extension, welcome. Rhonda Gibler and I are going to give you an update today on where we are budgetarily. And you'll recall that we started this last May, and it was in the interest of starting to build more of an open books culture, open books management culture here at Mizzou. And we thought it would be good to update you today and talk to you a bit about where we are with the budget now that Census Day is over, and so we have a better sense, no pun intended, of where we are. And we would share that with you. And then we'd also talk to you about some of the other things that we're planning to do. By way of background, I think you know the financial situation has been under some pressure for the last many years. This past year was particularly, or the one we're in right now, is particularly difficult for us because, of course, we did have a diminution in the numbers of students who are coming here. And after 10 or more years of steady year-over-year growth, of course, we had to trim our budgets. For those of you who haven't thought a lot about this, I'll just say that we are very much a cash flow kind of enterprise, meaning that what comes in is that which we have and that which we spend. And that's part of why we are where we are right now. The campus is facing a backlog in repair and maintenance of about $748 million in our education and general buildings. This has come about over a long period of time. I would say at least 10 years, but probably more like 20 years if you look at it. Now, we've all, I think, tried to be good stewards of the resources that were entrusted to us. And we are, in fact, kind of in a pinch, if you will, because on the one hand, a significant fraction of our budget is still made up of the appropriation, and there's always considerable uncertainty, as we saw this year in the making of the state budget and in the allocation of our appropriation. Again, we're very happy to say that by the end of the year, we did get a 4% increase in the allocated appropriation for this campus, and we're very, very pleased about that. And then on the other side, which makes us a little different than other states, we have Senate Bill 385, which limits any tuition increases we make to in-state tuitions to the same percentage as that of the Consumer Price Index, CPI. And because there are lots of things in that basket of goods, including gasoline and energy, CPI last year went up by about 0.7. So that's a tough one for us because, as you'll see later in the slides, when Rhonda shows you more of the information, 80% of what we spend every year is on us. It's on ourselves. 60% is salary, and another 21% is really in benefits. So that means that our rates of inflation for our costs of each other are going up much higher than CPI. Just think about the benefits portion for a minute. That's going up anywhere from 5 to 6 to 7% in some years. And so if you normalize that over your whole compensation package, that's as if the whole compensation package were going up 2.5%. So whatever kind of index we could use that would be closer to a business such as ours, or an enterprise, I should say, such as ours, that's 80% people costs, might be better for us in the long run. Now, some of our most prestigious and productive areas of research also require that we start making investments in order to remain among the best in the world. We'd like to invest, obviously, in every aspect of the university. But in the short term, we do have to do some things to shore up reputation and productivity, and we'll have to do that by starting to invest in our strengths. And before we do that, we wanted to have discussion with you, dialogue and feedback, and that's part of what today is meant to be. So we've been operating for a number of years now in a very decentralized fashion. There are very good reasons for that, to operate in that manner, one of which happens to be that it puts decision-making at the right level in the institution, where it can have the most impact usually. On the other hand, when you're so decentralized and decision-making goes that far out, then it's hard for us to pull resources together that are necessary to move the campus forward as a whole. So part of what we're wrestling with right now, too, is not just budget, but it's also really our culture and how we think about maybe swinging the pendulum a little bit back towards the middle so they're not quite as decentralized, and perhaps we can begin to make some forward progress. Now, as part of decentralization, we've always allowed carry forward resources that are generated in units across campus to largely remain in the unit. We've been in many respects holding on, waiting for a better day, waiting for the day when in fact we wouldn't have to worry about that. And we started through the strategic plan to pull together some resources on a recurring basis. Now, Rhonda will take you through, once again, the idea of recurring money, or what we call here at Mizzou rate money, versus one-time money, which is our savings bank and our savings account, which is really cost money in the lexicon of the accounts that run our university. So we'll have to look at that. A difficult step that we've got to really wrestle with as a community is to take some of that carry forward money and use it as a resource base that we can invest now, some portion of it that we can invest now. That same money, if we do that, is money that we can then go out and seek to match. And when I say match, there are really three different ways that I could see that we can match money that we put up ourselves to get some of these things accomplished. One is with state dollars. We've had a 50-50 program for a number of years, and that's quite helpful to us. Lafferty Hall has benefited from that. What are some of the others that have benefited? I guess the business building, the new business building, and others. A second area, in certain places, we could go after federal matching funds, and we will consider that wherever we can. And the third, of course, is private resources. Private resources of alums and private resources of corporations. But I think from what we can tell and what we can gather, we really need to be able to go first on some of these things to convince those other sources to come in and to share in the cost of some of these things with us. So funding agencies and donors tend to like to help those who are seeking to help themselves. So as we start into our FY17 budget forums, we enter the year knowing that we're going to need to cover a gap of approximately $6.8 million, and we'll be doing some of that from carry forward funds, which are largely held in units across the campuses. But I think that's where I'd like to stop and actually start the slide presentation, which I think will be much more illustrative than just giving you words. So could we start that? And I'll turn it over to Rhonda here. And I will try to comment as we go on what I think is important as Rhonda puts this forward. Thank you.
All right, so as Hank alluded to, I was going to remind you a bit. When we got together in May, we talked with folks about the difference between recurring resources and one-time resources. And we're going to talk some about both today. So I want to have that fresh in your mind that there is a distinct difference there. When we have recurring resources, those are the kinds of things we put salaries against because it's a cost that's going to continue and you need to have a recurring revenue source for that. And then there are one-time funds, which are savings and other things that accumulate, but you can't absolutely expect that they will occur again in the future. So part of the reason where we're at Mizzou is that we're part of all of public higher education. Some of the pressures that we have are not just uniquely because the things in Missouri are worse than everywhere else or the decision points are so much harder. Higher education in general, and in particular public higher education, has a number of things that we're facing. And we're going to have to work together to find new ways to solve some of these problems. Certainly competition for students will continue to be something that we have to keep in mind. We do have historically done very well on that front, and that's something that is top of mind in terms of as we think about future revenue. But while we're thinking about bringing in new students, and another way to bring in revenue with students is the price you charge, but we also have this absolute expectation of accountability, affordability, and access. And all of those things hinge on how it is we price ourselves and the expectation that it can be a reality for many, many citizens to be able to go to a public higher education institution. Certainly state funding capacity has been a pressure on all of public higher education. There's been a significant shift in the amount of money that on a per student basis goes into supporting public higher ed. And so we, like Many others are faced with dealing with that gap that's occurring. And then, as Hank referenced, there's an aging infrastructure. So for many years, the state made significant investments in our infrastructure, and now we have an amazing campus, but it's not evergreen on its own. It has to have investment in it for us to be able to continue to make good use of it. So this is just to put numbers in perspective. So when we talk about the general operations of the university, and so we're talking about the general fund that many people think of when they think of the university. Now, in our May discussions, we talked about enterprise operations and we showed you what a lot of that looks like. But if you just look at the general operations fund, we get 58% of our money from tuition and fees, 36% from state support, and we get about 6% from recovered F&A or overhead. We spend that pool of resources, 62% on salary and wages, 19% on benefits, and 19% on operating expenses. So you can see the primary driver on a recurring basis for the resource base we have is the people. And that's as it should be. We're a people organization.
So I'd like to jump in here. This is what I was talking about a minute ago when I said we're a cash flow enterprise, right? So year to year, we have no more to spend in our recurring dollars than that which we bring in by these sources, right? Recovered F&A, by the way, is that which we get from the government on our research enterprise. And then that gets pushed over here into our expenses. And the one point I wanted to make again here is that 19% of those expenses are our benefits, and our benefits are crucial to us, but our benefits always go up faster than our tuition and fees or our state support. So that's part of what we're grappling with year to year. So when we're trying to make a budget, when Rhonda's team is trying to make a budget, as you saw, I think, throughout the spring, it's a process of estimation, right? It's a process really of guesstimation. What do we guess the state will give us on the second line? What do we guess our student inflow will be on the first line? And what's the mix of students going to be? So then they'd go down even deeper and they say, okay, it's not just the incoming students, but it's the mix of incoming students from in-state versus out-of-state. And then it's the mix of students who we retain from the previous years. So the algorithms that they've developed over the number of years take all of that into account and tend to reduce our uncertainty until you get to a year like this past year where it didn't matter what the uncertainty was, we knew we were going to be down. But I think you're going to see here in Rhonda's calculations, or the ones her team does. Where's Todd? I saw Todd. Todd does a lot of this. They're really good at this. It's shocking how good they are at refining these numbers ahead of time. But this is really important to understand. What comes in goes out. But we don't have any more to spend than what comes in.
So when we talked with folks back in May, this was our estimate of where we thought we would come in with enrollment. And this was showing you where we would have changes in enrollment. So we were predicting that we'd be down a total of 2,630 students for a total enrollment on campus of about 32,008.
A little too fast.
Yeah, I didn't touch anything. So this is just to remind you where we thought we would be. Then Census Day has come. You probably heard opening day numbers. We came in at 32,777 students on opening day. Census Day is a better day in terms of when we're trying to predict where we may be with revenue. Monday was Census Day for us. And so we come in at 33,266. So that's an improvement over where we were predicting we'd be in terms of budget. So this is the good news portion of today's event. We built a budget around 32.8. We're coming in higher than that. You can't get much happier than coming in a little bit over where you planned. This is a reminder of where our finances were projected to stand if that enrollment of 32.8 and the mix we were guessing at came in absolutely right. So we were expecting to have a $31.4 million budget gap to address. We addressed 24.6 million of that by pulling back 5% of the, making a reduction to the allocation that goes out all across the campus. Probably everyone in this room, or the vast majority of you, painfully are aware that that 5% reduction happened. And we decided to cover the other 6.8 using some one-time resources, and we let people know ahead of time that if we need to dip into this, this means we're going to have to ask folks for some one-time money back.
So that, just to stop again, is one place where we can go. So it's like a big water tank over here, where if we don't have enough water coming in a year, we could pull a cupful out of that tank and pour it in over into our expenditure side. But we can't do that year after year after year.
Yeah,
so that's why that's limited in how much we can do.
And so here's where we stand in September. So right now, based on the enrollment coming in a little better than what we budgeted, we have a gap of only about $100,000. So that's very good news, but it's September, so there's still another whole semester. There's a lot of other things that can happen between today and the end of the fiscal year, but we're feeling pretty good that our budget is in good shape, and we won't be having to dig a lot deeper into one-time resources than we had predicted at the beginning of the year.
Has everybody got that? Because we kind of, these two slides look so similar, you may not have seen Rhonda switch them.
Yes, it says September at the top of this one, and this one looks better. Certainly, you see the adjustment, so that enrollment is a reduction of 21,000, or 2,000, God forbid, 2,182 students. So then again, that's looking at the mix of those students and what the actual change in revenue that.
Somebody's going to wonder why I said 4%, we only included 3.5%, so we got to tell them that.
So at the state level, they did allocate 4%. The amount that has already been passed through to our campus at this point in time is 3.5%, so that's 7.9 million. There is an anticipated additional support related to inclusion, diversity, and equity. So at the system level, they have maintained a little piece of that so that they can assist all of the campuses in making those kinds of investments. So this is what, when we have to make it all balance on our campus, this is what we expect right now, is that we absolutely know 7.9 million is in our revenue stream.
And the other thing, I guess it's important to say, is it's words are funny here. We call it a funding shortfall, but it's really just this year's difference versus last year's income. Do you see what I'm saying? So it's not as if we have a fixed budget. It's whatever comes in, we spend. So a better way to look at it is just change in revenue, right? And therefore, what we must do in terms of expenditures.
Right.
Right.
So, but the part that's laid in there is we did make additional investments this year. So the change in revenue is 14.4 all in, but then there were additional allocations that were made to address a whole number of strategic investments. So that it's related to a number of graduate student support items, as well as inclusion, diversity, and equity on our campus are the primary drivers of the strategic investments in the current year. So this is good news. We're guardedly optimistic. We'll see how the next semester plays out, and typically by sometime in the February timeframe, we're pretty confident where we're going to end the year in terms of revenue in total. So we have, as I've already said, lots of pressures on how we're going to operate into the future, and I was going to let Hank talk a little bit about this cadre of things that we need to be investing in on a recurring basis. So these are all things that have ongoing increasing costs associated with them.
So compensation, salaries, and benefits, we've been struggling on the salary side for a number of years now, and I don't need to tell you that because most of you have experienced it. The only way I could see how we can get out of that is we've got to build back our student base, we've got to bring them back, we've got to increase our revenue flow. But then what we also have to do is we have to work together to figure out how we do not immediately increase our expenditures when we bring in those new students. Now, this is the really tricky and hard part. But what we've done in the past is reasonable enough, but it won't work in the future if we want to be able to reward you with salary increases. The only way we could give you salary increases is if we bring back revenues higher, but we don't bring back costs immediately. All right, so we've got to find ways to create some margin, if you will, new margin under the revenue curve. And then also part of open books management is you put people first, and then you find ways to provide them with gain share. So every time, now if we were a company and we had a profit motive, we would talk about profit sharing, but we're not. So we'll talk about gain sharing. And what we're going to have to do is work out ways this year to figure out how to make that part of open books management work as well. We don't know exactly how to do that yet. We would be one of the first big universities to actually try open books management, but it's used worldwide quite successfully. And it tends to increase trust, and it tends to increase participation and engagement once everybody really understands what the game is and what it is we're trying to do together. And so I'd like to really start to work on that, and that's what we decided last April, why we'd start to hold these forums, so that you'd see we're not hiding anything from you. We're a public institution. We should not hide anything from you. But you also have to know that we've got to work together to find ways to make these gains, if you will. And the gains can come either on the revenue side of those charts, or it can come over on the expenditure side. Now, I used to love to teach with engineering students using computers and computation and so forth. So I immediately start to think like an engineer, and I admit that, which is to think about how can I get more students in the classroom for no extra fixed cost. And if I could do that, right, beyond the cost of the instructor and so forth, then we start to have some extra revenue flow, which creates margin, which we can then share back with people who work on those kinds of projects. That is, really doing excellent teaching, using technology as one example, and teaching large classes successfully. So those are the kinds of things we're going to be looking for, but I'm one person with one idea. There are 13,000 people across this campus with other ideas. And it's not just in teaching, it's across the whole campus. Remember, only about 2,500 of us are actually faculty. The other 11,000 are doctors, nurses, pipe fitters, electricians, plumbers, and so forth. So we got to get everybody to sort of understand that we're in this together. The facilities and maintenance issue is one that is a real tough one. If you talk to Gary Ward, or I think Rhonda will show you later, Gary Ward's our chief of operations, and he'll tell you that we really keep a lot of things looking nice on the outside, which is important. Students make a decision about when they visit your campus, whether you're going to be a place that they'll consider or not, within 15 minutes, research shows. So appearances matter. Now, I remember when I was a young faculty member, I couldn't understand why presidents and chancellors wasted money on flowers and tulips and grass. That's why, right? It's really crucial to getting students to come here, visit, feel like we're a place they want to be a part of. But we've got a lot of buildings right now that have repair and maintenance indices that are frankly way off from where they ought to be. In fact, we have some buildings that are bad enough that they would be condemned in the real world, and some of you live in them and work in them every day. So that's another big problem. Utilities, insurance, and IT licenses. That's kind of Rhonda's baby. She understands all that stuff, but I think our insurance costs go up every year because we have to insure against more and more things. Do you want to say something about those four?
The main thing is I want to give folks kind of a sampling of the sorts of things that are increasing every year. So certainly the compensation, the salary and benefits, folks may feel like, well, that hasn't changed that much because I've been here and I don't feel like it's changed that much. But when the additional revenue we're bringing in is fairly small, these other things are largely outside of our control. So if insurance is up, if utilities are up year over year, those things eat up any additional revenue very quickly, which then for the last number of years, all of those need items get addressed, and it leaves us with no room to do what we'd like to do in terms of compensation and benefits. So I just wanted folks to have a sense that we're going to talk about one-time costs here in a moment, but these are things that you have to have new recurring money for every year. It's occasionally you'll have a dip in your insurance rates, but not very often. These are all things that tend to keep increasing over time.
You know, we've got to work on this because we don't want to end up like, well, my daughter is a public school teacher in Denver, and she buys supplies, right, for her students and herself for the year out of her own pay. And that's kind of where this is heading, right, is, you know, we've got to create more margin so we could give you salary increases, not just benefit increases. We've got to create more margin so we could reinvest in maintenance. We got to create more margin under the revenue curve so that we could buy computers for you and we could keep the copying machines on. How many of you remember early in our careers when you had to pay 3 cents a sheet for copying? It was just incredible, right? And then that kind of all went away, and that's good. But we've got to be sure that we get back and attack some of those ground level problems. Department chairs need to be able to have some money in their hands that they can use to help you get through that which you need to do as teachers and as researchers.
So switching from recurring things, so expenses that are going to go up year after year after year, we also have a whole laundry list of things that could be addressed with one-time money, but the list is long and the dollar amounts are huge. So we've already referenced the backlog in maintenance and repair. This $748 million, part of the reason this comes about is because on a recurring basis, we weren't finding the money to keep up year after year in doing as much routine maintenance as we should have. So we've got buildings that have fallen into significant disrepair. I put a few on the list of things that we know. The list, I'll show you a map here in a moment. There's actually 40 buildings on our campus that are in a significant state in terms of you reach a certain point and it's better to either just gut and renovate the whole building or take a building down and rebuild it than it is to just keep trying to fix the small problems. We also, in the vein of being a strong university into the future, we have to continue to find ways to differentiate ourselves. So why is it students are going to choose Mizzou over the many other choices they have? One of the reasons this university is chosen often is because we're a research university, and we have to find ways to maintain strength and visibility. So there are certain parts of what we do in the research enterprise that currently have a lot of visibility and can be very helpful in making sure that our brand is strong. So there's certain things, and you see plant growth facilities on here twice. Well, we have some number of plant growth facilities on our campus that are sadly behind where they ought to be, but they're there, and we're using them for research right now, and we're one of the best in plant research in the world. We also need to be investing in additional space for plant growth facilities if we want to continue to be a worldwide player in that arena. And then we know that the IT infrastructure only lasts so long. So I was here when we switched to PeopleSoft from the old mainframe. You have all these systems that make things work. Now I understand many people say PeopleSoft make things work, but it does make a lot of things work. People do get their paychecks, and we do have all these processes that happen. Well, those infrastructure items from an IT perspective are now aged back to 1999 when we switched into the current way of doing business. The future is in the cloud. To make that leap from where we're at now with our IT infrastructure to the enterprise systems we'll need in the future, it's going to be a large one-time expense at the time we decide to make that adjustment.
Some of these at the top have been in the planning stages for 10 or 15 years.
Yes.
With no progress made.
Exactly.
And you know, if you look at some of them, they're so important to the state, right? Some are very important to us as a university. We've got to get going on them. School of Nursing, for example, is a fish that's grown to the same size as the tank that it's in. So it needs to flex and grow because there's a desperate need for rural health care in Missouri. That used to be supplied by doctors of osteopathy and the like. Once they were made even with medical doctors, Medical practice in the urban areas looked much more attractive financially than in the rural areas. Now we need advanced practical nurses who want to do that kind of rural medicine. We need to get them out there, but we need to have a bigger nursing school so we can produce more of those people and help in that way. Our number one industry in the state of Missouri is agriculture. Agriculture is getting more strained all the time, right? We see changes in climate. We see years coming when the population of the earth may reach 12 billion people. I won't be here, I don't think, when that happens, but some of you will be. And it's clear to almost everyone that plant science is crucial to that future, not just for food, but also probably for energy. And then the School of Music, you know, one would like to think that Columbia would become a center of the arts, and that would be a wonderful place. And I think it is, and we have some fantastic people there. But that project, I think, has probably been on the books now for 15 years. The good news is we have a major donor who wants to help us with it. So we, Rhonda and I, have found a way to allocate $8 million so that we can help get that project off the ground as a strategic initiative.
So as promised, this is the map of our campus, and it's the E and G, that stands for education in general. So the gold buildings just represent those that are supported through the central set of resources. There's many more buildings on our campus that are from enterprise and auxiliary operations, so the athletics and the healthcare buildings you don't see in gold because they cover their own costs. They have to maintain their own facilities. This shows you in red, that's the number of buildings that are requiring pretty much complete renovation on our campus. So you do an assessment of how much of the building really needs to be replaced, and we work with some great tools to help understand just where we're at with some of these buildings. But you can see the number of red buildings is, well, there's lots of words for it. I'll just settle for depressing, but it's a lot of work ahead of us, and there are going to have to be multiple strategies over time how we work on this. So one of the things, so I mentioned that one reason we've gotten here is that when each recurring year budget got tough through numerous periods in our history, we just tweaked a little bit more off of how much money we were going to put into maintenance to try and hold everything as steady as we could. We've tweaked that down so far that we're now adding to that backlog every year to the clip of over $30 million of more maintenance that isn't getting done that needs to be done. So over time, you'll hear us talk about numerous strategies to deal with this. And what this means, it doesn't mean that people are at risk of life and limb in these buildings, but it does mean that trying to keep them up and running becomes more and more expensive over time. And so there'll be a number of approaches we look at over the next couple of years to start putting strategies forward.
So we're right here right now, right, in Memorial? Do I have that right? Do I have my finger in the right place? And we're actually right in here in Jesse Ranch. The reason that doesn't show up, even though it needs major renovation, this building, is because it's under Kathy Scroggs, right? So it's part of the auxiliary unit that we just lump and call student affairs. In passing, I know that Kathy is planning a renovation of this building. So in transparency, I don't want you to be surprised if you see that happening. She has her own reserves, and she's planning to use those reserves. Well, why does she have her own reserves? Well, because they run like a tub on their own bottom, which is to say that they generate cash flow from their residence halls and use that to build new things, build new residence halls, carry the loans on mortgages on those halls, and so forth. Similarly, athletics does the same thing, which is why you don't see those showing up, although some of them need it as well. So this is really just the academic enterprise itself.
So, as I was saying, there are going to have to be multiple strategies for us as we move forward to take on both the sides of that issue. And I believe you've heard at different times, we know we've got to restore and strengthen our brand. That is job one right now. We've got to help people understand what Mizzou is in the broader sense than what people heard a lot about in the fall. There's a lot of good going on here, and that part is what we're working very hard to ensure that prospective students and others understand what they can expect when they come to Mizzou. We need to invest in the areas where we have some national and international strength, so that, again, that can help build our brand as well as maintain our research capabilities. One of the strategies we expect to use is utilize some amount of our own resources to carefully jumpstart where we're going to go. So evidence to folks who are watching that we believe in us. We know that this university has a lot yet to offer, and we're going to put our own money on the table to get that started. We know we have to explore potential changes to our pricing model. We have to think about where we're at now, why we got there, and where we need to be in the future. I spent an hour today with a couple of students asking questions about transparency in our supplemental fees and how those things work. And over time, we want to make sure that we can have a model that prices things appropriately and is transparent for students and families. We want to explore changes to the allocation of our resources. So we have a very blended model. We have some historical base in how we allocate resources, but we also have, through online programs, a sharing of revenues. We have a variety of ways in which we put things together. We're going to have to look at all of that and make sure that our allocation model reinforces our values and priorities as a university. And then we're going to have to identify ways where we can continue to drive costs down. And that the answer to that piece is a whole bevy of answers. There's every different part of the university will have different ways they can look at that issue, and we need people to be doing that, because at the campus level, it would be really difficult for us to know each of the tweaks that could be made in each of your areas to keep costs contained or find ways that we could make cost reductions. But all of these things have to be on the table. And one of the things that I've noticed over the many years I've been at our university is change is really hard, and that's hard for all people. But we're 170 years old, 78 years old. And I'm finding the older I get, change seems harder. So I think we have so much tradition and so much culture that approaching some of these changes has been very difficult. But we have many more years of future, and so we have to be willing to put all of those things on the table and make adjustments so that we can thrive into the future. So Hank referenced some current ways that we do business that we really need to think about and consider for some adjustment. So when he's talking about the cash, it comes in, it goes out. Currently where we are as a campus is the general fund revenues come in and they all go out. We don't currently keep a whole set of those recurring funds at the campus level for contingency purposes or for investment purposes. And there have been times in our history where we were able to do this. When our enrollment was growing faster than we would have expected, then each year we were creating a little bit of that potential contingency or capital investment money. Where we stand today, when you give all the money out, there's really no opportunity for us to have a set of resources at the campus to make broad investments that impact the whole university. All the savings from vacancies on our campus are retained at the CSD is College School Division level. So there's a very good reason we do that. It sets the right tone for people keeping the right positions, for filling the positions that are most in need, but it doesn't create any savings at the campus level for us to have a store of one-time resources to make investments with. And then collectively, we've been very good stewards of the resources entrusted to us. There's a significant amount of one-time resources if you looked at us collectively as a university, but that money is largely held out across the campus in thousands, literally, of accounts all over the campus. And we understand that people are holding that resource for contingencies, for equipment replacement. There's lots of reasons people hold those funds, but there's very little incentive when the money is broken out into thousands of baskets for people to work together on the big investments. There's a tendency to believe, well, that's somebody else's problem. Well, having a strong Mizzou that helps all of us move forward and project the image we want requires us all to work together on some number of these issues. So one of the proposals we have is to consider a 3-year recovery of some of those one-time funds. So we would be asking that about 2% be pulled back from those balances, and those would be in unrestricted accounts. So this doesn't mean gift money or grant money or things that have outside restrictions, but we would pull back 2% of those balances each year, so in the current year 17, 18, and 19. And then we would pull back 2% of unrestricted plant funds, which plant funds are a place where people set resources aside for very large purchases into the future. So the first year it would be 2% on unrestricted plant funds, but in 18 and 19 it would be just new transfers into the plant fund. Now the reason we do that is from the outside looking in, it hasn't mattered a lot whether you held your money in the plant fund or in the unrestricted current fund. And so some people have used the plant fund very effectively and some folks haven't used it at all. And so in the first cycle, it would be putting everyone on the same playing field in terms of whether you were using them effectively or not. But then in future years, if you put money in the plant fund, you have articulated what you're saving it for, what the investment's going to be, and this would encourage folks to put that money in a place and label it appropriately. So when we get asked, well, what is all that money for? We have answers for those questions. By going through this process in this 3 years, it's a way for us to jumpstart investment in some important initiatives we have as a university, and to be able to do it just for 3 years. Now, we've been talking about this with the deans, the chairs, several different meetings I've been to. We've talked about this as a proposal, and a popular thing I get told is, sure, you'll stop after 3 years. Well, the idea would be that as we build back our revenue base, we would hold a contingency reserve in the future so that we would have some amount of one-time money that is held at the campus level that allows for these kinds of investments. So if we can discipline ourselves as we pull that revenue back into the organization, it will put us in a different place. And if the campus has some amount of money to work with, we can use it to leverage other funds. So it gives us a position to work with the state, with potential donors, and honestly with all of you. If people discipline themselves and put aside resources to do something important, and the campus can then further that incentive by saying, okay, we're gonna take some of our money and help you leverage your money, that encourages people to be building for the future themselves. When we don't have a resource to try and acknowledge people who are moving things in the right direction, it just becomes a, well, thank you very much for doing the right thing. And you know, some people do the right thing always, no matter what. Other folks like a little encouragement. So this is what we'd be talking about. And here's a few more points that I thought people would be interested in. The first the first use of funds that would be recovered through this process would be to address any shortfall in the revenue. So we thought we might need $7 million. Right now, might be $100,000 by the end of the year. It's likely some number between those two, maybe $500,000. We'll just see how the year plays out. But then the balance of the funds that are recovered each year would be invested in some of the high priority capital items for the campus. So some of those facility things we've been talking about. Then each year, the campus would report to folks how much was recovered, what we did with it, so that folks had a sense of here's what was recovered, here's where it came from, here's what we used it for. And then in future years, that contingency that I'm talking about holding on a recurring basis, we would have that same expectation, that we would show you what that's generating and what it's being invested in each year.
Good.
I think that's the end of our slides.
So what we're going to do now is take questions and try to answer questions as they come to you. Go back, we can look at any of the slides, but go ahead. Yeah. Can I get my
Yes.
my kit? Mm-hmm. You're welcome.
I have a question or an entreaty, I guess. Given that you're going to be transparent in the future about what you've collected and where it's going to go, you could help build the trust with us in the community by explaining the 2% taxes that you've been taking out of budgets over the last few years and where that has gone. We get announcements that you made some strategic investments. Okay, what were they? So if you start with that, this will make it a lot easier for us to get on side with you in the coming years.
So I could start if you want. That the 2% recurring was 1% of it was used, frankly, in operations, right? To keep the lights on, to keep the electricity, to keep all of that going. And that decision predates my arrival. The second 1% is an allocation that the deans agreed to when I was still in my old job about 3 years ago to start to use and put towards hiring people who could really help us in some of these critical areas. I don't have a detailed accounting. We could get a detailed accounting of all of that. But I could tell you we could do it. It's not hard to do. There's no hocus pocus. There's nowhere, I mean, first, there isn't even that much money. And secondly, the places we put it are places I think you'd expect us to put it, which is not a very accurate answer. Perhaps you could give a more accurate answer.
Well, and we did each year have forums, and we did put up that kind of information. So we had showed how much of it was going into the strategic hiring of faculty. We had investments that absolutely were the keeping the things moving sort of stuff. So insurance costs and things of that nature.
Do we have the slide from the spring? So we said $7 million of this year's pullback, the one we're in. We allocated that out. What was it? $3 million was going to go towards grad student.
It was $10 million. And we did the stipend increases for graduate students, and that was about $3 million.
$3 million.
We did 2.5 towards tuition waivers for graduate students.
We did.
We had 1.5 million for the Division of Inclusion, Diversity, and Equity. It's not in this slide deck. It's a different slide deck.
So in the spring, we covered each of those and how we were going to use it, but we could do that again.
Yes, absolutely, we can.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes.
Would you please explain that plan fund a little bit more, a little bit lost with that in terms of year 17 and the next 2 years?
What do you mean by plant funds?
Last slide.
Yes, so the way we hold money at the university is in different fund groupings. So you have your current unrestricted fund, and then we have what is called the plant fund, which is a place that people can put one-time money aside, and many of them do it every single year because they know they have a big item they need to replace. So big users of the plant fund right now would be student affairs. They know that there are replacement things they need to do in the residence halls and they need to do with dining. And so they set aside money each year, they put it in the plant fund. And that's to reflect the fact that these funds are being held for very specific investment in the future. So to put money in the plant fund, you articulate why you're setting it aside. And then when you take money back out of the plant fund, you express what you're using it for. We have money that sits in our current unrestricted fund that probably should be there. People should articulate why they're holding it, what they plan to do with it, and they should set it aside in that fashion. But historically, people haven't accounted for it that accurately. They've let it sit in the unrestricted current. One of the issues with having money of that nature sitting there is it can appear to people who look at our financial statements that we have a lot of money that we don't have a specific purpose for. And we know we do. And if I talk to each one of the folks in the room who look at their own operation and how much money they have, people can quickly start telling me what they need it for. But as a university, we don't have a collection of those explanations. We just know that if you ask each person, they'll tell you, I absolutely need all of that and I need more. There are other things that I don't even have addressed in that. So part of what we're wanting to do is get people to record for us officially why they're holding that resource, so that when we're asked the question, we can quickly say, well, here are the top 10 reasons we have money in the plant fund.
So for year 17, are you going to take 2% from us? We have that.
So the proposal is that,
Proposal.
it's not going backwards for me, is that the money that's held in the unrestricted, so these are the balances. So the 5% reduction in recurring resources is one thing. This is the balances that are held in people's individual accounts. So 2% of the unrestricted current balances would be pulled back to centrally invest in a variety of important endeavors. And then the next year on the plant fund, it would just be new transfers into the plant fund. So if somebody already has $10 million sitting in the plant fund, the first year they would pay 2%, but the next year they'd only pay 2% on $500,000 they moved into it versus the whole 10 million that's there.
Other questions? Yes? Do you have a question?
My name is Steve Siegel. I'm a professor in medical pharmacology and physiology. And from some of the things that I had heard preceding this meeting, I put together a few comments that I'd like to make that actually you have already begun to address. So if I may, just take a second here. So I was hired here 10 years ago. I was recruited from Yale University as a tenured full professor. I'm not trying to wave my flag. I just want to use myself as an example of other people who are in a similar situation. My biggest reason for coming to the University of Missouri was I felt that the administration had confidence in me as a PI and what I did. I have been funded continuously by the NIH. When I came here, I had 3 R01s. I'm now down to 1. Other people in this room can tell you how difficult it is to maintain R01s. The funds that I have accrued from the indirect costs that have come back to me, I have worked extremely hard to hold, if you will, okay? These funds give me money to work with that I would not be able to do things with otherwise. What have I utilized these for? The primary thing that I have done with the monies that I have held, including my startup package, is to use those monies to recruit new young faculty and to help them get started with their labs. I don't have to give you dollar amounts. I'm just going to tell you what I've been using that money for. I support undergraduates at the hourly level. I support graduate student stipends and pay tuition to the university with that money. I fund my postdocs. Not all of them. They write their own grants as well. But if one of my postdocs falls between the cracks, I keep them funded until they can get a grant on their own and establish a career path for their own that they can go out and be successful. All of my postdocs that have left the university are now tenure track assistant professors at other institutions by adhering to this philosophy. The other thing I use this money for is to develop new areas of research. I have 2 brand new projects going on in my laboratory. I have asked the university for 0 money. There's very limited money that we have available to make available to new investigators. Because I have the resources that I have been able to accrue, and I'm not just speaking for myself, I have colleagues in the same situation, I'm not going to apply for those grants. I want that money to be available to other, particularly young faculty who have no other avenue to pursue developing new research programs. So I have 2 major lines of investigation that I am funding now out of these monies that ultimately will hopefully become R01s. So I'm investing not only in my own future, but as you know, these bring in revenue to the university. It's not just for me. The major concern that I have by you imposing a tax is I don't want to sound negative on this. It sounds like you have lost confidence in me as an investigator to run my own ship. And the thing that I'm worried about is not just me, but how do other people feel that I was told that I could carry over these money. I have it in writing. You can carry these money in my letters. And now you're going to take this money away from me. And yes, I want to do my share to contribute to the university. I do that every day as hard as I can. Okay, I'm just trying to get the point across, okay? One of the things that I find really difficult is we're recruiting top level people. We are spending huge amounts of money recruiting, at least in the medical school, and it's warranted. But there's no money around to help the younger people who need help on a more regular basis. And myself and some of the other PIs are trying to help plug some of these holes. So these are the major concerns that I have about being taxed, if you will, okay? And so I just want to express those feelings to you.
Okay. First of all, thank you for what you're doing. Thank you for doing that. I appreciate it. I think taking care of young people, young investigators is incredibly important. This is sort of the executive dilemma between that which you just described and other people in the room who need new facilities to do their work. And so what we've tried to do is to find a way to do it where, yes, we're taking back some of the money that you would use for those things, bring it back centrally for another group that's going to need it if we're going to keep advancing forward. One of those is plant science, for example. Another eventually will probably be nursing, although in nursing, I think we have other sources of income that we can use. But you now know what the executive dilemma is, because nothing you said is anything I can argue with. But on the other hand, I would say that these other needs are necessary as well.
So when you tell me you're going to take, if I have $100,000 and you're going to take 2% of that, so that's $2,000 you're going to take and use as appropriate. Okay, I'm happy to give you the $2,000. I don't have any problem with that. You tell me you're going to do it again the following year and the following year. So now for every $100,000 I have to think about now giving you $6,000. How do I know that that's really all okay, I'm going to budget accordingly. I'm going to account for that. How do I know that next year you're not going to come back and say, I'm sorry, but we need 5% this year, or 10%, or we need it all? How do I know? How do I protect that? Because the money that I have right now basically allows me to run my lab for 1 year if I don't have a grant. That's the safety net that I'm trying to build, not for myself. I'm not worried about me. I'm worried about these young people who I have promised to help get their degrees and move them on to jobs. And I have to keep enough inertia in my system to meet my commitment to these young people. That's what I'm trying to keep money for.
So that's why we've titrated it to 2% and not more. In the future, these are tough decisions, but I can't see us, if we say we're going to do it for 3 years, we'll only do it for 3 years. If we say it's 2%, it will only be 2%.
Then I will plan accordingly. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes.
I have a question from a live feeder, Joe Turner. Some academic departments and units have been very effective in creating reserves, while others have not been successful. It seems that the 2% withholding penalizes those who have been effective in generating reserves. Those who have deficits seem to get a free ride. How will they share in the 2% withholding?
So one of the pieces of the proposal is that it's 2% on positive balances, not net. So across parts of the university, if there are places that they have deficits, they don't get to count the deficit against all their positive balances. So that's one way we're trying to level that playing field. And then the fact is there are places that there are deficits because we knew there was going to be a deficit and we thought it was the right thing for the university to do. So an example would be in athletics. When they left the Big 12, they didn't decide to do that all on their own. It created a significant deficit that they're continuing to pay off. But they will pay it on their positive balances. So they don't get to take their deficit against all their positive balances and only pay on the difference. They will pay 2% on the positive balances that they're holding.
So I would also like to pick up on that and say that I understand that question. I know where it's coming from, and I can understand the feeling that goes with it. But then when you kind of get to a place where you're able to see the whole university and you look at the kinds of programs we have for recovery of funds, it really tends to favor those places where faculty can go out and bring in external grants and contracts. And so, of course, that tends to multiply and becomes a great kind of compounding effect in there. And then when you look at a college like Arts and Science, where they have, maybe in the sciences they do, but in the arts and humanities, they have very low capacity for that. But that, and I'm looking at you like you asked the question, right? But then you look at their budget, and they're making, creating a tremendous revenue and getting only half of it back as budget. Then you start to see how, if you only look at the unit level, you could feel that way. But if you look across the whole university, you start to see that it's not that simple. It's not that simple. A lot of it is the internal dynamics of what we've set up and what we've valued over time.
I have another streaming question, if no one else is going. The Campus Master Plan and Climate Action Plan published the 2016 STARS results. Mizzou scored 0 out of 7 points, the lowest score possible in the investment category. This is the only category in which the university scored a 0. Specifically, what investment decisions have been made that will promote environmental sustainability to better align with the campus master plan?
That's a question Gary Ward would be prepared to answer. What happens in all those buildings, I know that it costs money to become LEED certified, so there are times we do the things that make a building fit some of those expectations, but we don't go the extra mile of paying to get that classification. But I'm not familiar with the item they're referring to there. I'd be surprised if you do, Hank.
Yeah, I would be happy to ask Gary if you send us that question to get, that's a very specific answer, and we can only give a general overview. He could give a much more specific answer. So if that person sends it to me or to Rhonda, we'll forward it to Gary Ward and ask him to answer it by email.
Perfect.
Hey, Mike.
So I want to ask a question relative to the 2%. So I am under the impression that the fiscal year 16 numbers at June 30th is where you're going to do your calculations from for that 2%. So the question I'd ask you, since you already know that number, what is the projected amount that will be coming in to the campus that you'll be able to utilize and prioritize your decision?
This is currently a proposal, so we've
Right.
certainly run a number of scenarios, and the books are almost closed, but I don't think they're completely closed. I'm looking for one of the accounting folks to tell me whether they're completely closed. But when we run those scenarios with the hospital in, which is another question that we're still in conversation about, because the hospital has to have days cash on hand, and so part of that balance they have. But hospital and the campus all told, positive balances are $888 million. So everybody's positive balances all accumulated together.
So 2% of that amount.
And right now, we're probably not going to be able to keep all of those things in there. So we really would move to try and have as few exceptions as possible, but there are certainly things that, although the fund says unrestricted, there are restrictions. So those things would have to be looked at. So I don't, since we're still talking with people about it, gaining feedback, we've gotten some very good information regarding accounts receivable items and things of that nature. So if we were to go forward with this proposal, we would be nailing down some of those specifics to arrive at a final number of what we think. But at this point, if you didn't make any exceptions, it would be 2% of that number.
Okay, and then the projected fiscal 17, 18, et cetera, that would be also the June 30th
It'll be the
numbers?
finally closed finances.
Okay.
So we wouldn't run it at June 30. We would wait until the whole fiscal year has been closed. So people make a lot of entries in the July and early August timeframe to officially close the books, and some number of those entries are moving resources between the current fund and the plant fund. So we would always wait till the whole fiscal year has closed and then make an assessment then.
And then my last question would be is, have you given some thought about making sure that, for instance, those entities that have a lot of reserves, that they're forced to put that 2% into the entity itself to improve it? For instance, I mean, if Kaffner is sitting on a reserve, then a lot of that should be going towards supporting the plant growth facilities. If the medical school is sitting on reserves, it goes to support maybe the building of the, translational medicine building.
So we haven't thought about quite that much detail yet, but what we'd probably try to do is not that. I'll just be honest, you know me, I'm always straightforward. We probably kind of go through and say, all right, what's the most important priority right now? Where do we think we can make the most progress and really have the most impact? And right now, I got to tell you, the plant sciences are an area that I'm really worried about. It's an area where we are within, a very small distance of being the very best in the world. It's a very serious issue, what's going on with climate change and plants. We have some outstanding opportunities. This part of the country, in particular, outside of St. Louis, is becoming the world epicenter for plant science. I'm not a plant scientist, but I could see kind of what the future probably would look like there based on what people have taught me about it. So I'll put my cards on the table and say that would be the first one. I feel that way because it's a $90 million project in total. We'd like to put out over 3 years, maybe $30 million to get it started with our own funds, seek additional $30 million maybe from the state, hopefully, with some help from our friends at CAFNR and in the ag community, and maybe another $30 million from private donors so we could get that off the books and put the plant sciences where they need to be. Now, if you look at what Iowa State has done in schools in the region, we are just falling further and further behind. And I think that's really crucial for us. Similarly, I talked about the other areas. The list is endless. There's no doubt about it. So there have to be some decisions made, and ultimately somebody has to make a decision. Flipping a coin would not be a good way to do it. But I understand what you're saying. I hadn't thought about it that way. It's interesting.
Yeah, we have had lots of conversation, however, about how to make sure that we leverage. So when I talked about, for the future, if the campus has resources, we want to set that dynamic that people see that as a way to partner, and so they can, if they are able to put their resources aside, they can partner with us. The other thing, though, that we are very much working with plant sciences on is if we're able to find a way to build the first phase, they've got to help us cover the operating costs because the operating costs are annual. So for the first phase of that project, it's $1.3 million every year to operate that facility. And so the conversation has largely been around, one, they can put some one-time money in it, but also that they have to be working with us on a business plan that helps address that operating cost. Because if Gary Ward were here, he would tell you that finding the capital money to build a building is hard. So on a scale from 1 to 10, he always says finding the capital is an 8. Finding the operating cost is an 11. Because you can get donors potentially excited about building the building, but people don't get excited about keeping the lights on and the heat working and all those sorts of things. And so if you're going to build new space, you have to address, well, how are you going to maintain it and keep it heated and cooled?
Now, I will also add that at this point last year, looking ahead, maybe not this point last year, last spring, early in the spring, I was thinking differently. I was thinking that we could maybe have another increase in revenues and another increase in student numbers, and that maybe we could all work together and try to find, somewhere between $15 and $20 million of rate money that would be recurring so that we could go to the market and borrow $400 million. If we had $400 million, we could do the nursing school right now, we could do translational precision medicine, we could do the music school, we could do the plant sciences, and probably the incubator, and get it all done. The problem is we'd had the shortfall in student numbers. So the optimist in me says to those who are a little skeptical, no, I really think this is a stopgap measure. I don't see this as a long-term strategy. I don't think it can be. But I do think that it gets us started on some of these projects and will, I hope, what's the word when you have a pump? It will prime the pump.
Prime it.
Prime the pump. It's funny when you sit up here how words disappear from your head. But we'd prime the pump, Mike, so that we could get more money coming in to help us get going. But we've got to find a way to get these student numbers back, and we've got to find a way to keep fixed costs fixed and not increase. We can't keep adding every time we add students, add more faculty and staff and administrators. We've got to get out of that cycle, and that's hard. But it begins here. It begins, I think, by just telling you honestly what we're facing. Yes.
I have a question. Elizabeth Brida wants to reiterate that the cost recovery of 2% from unrestricted funds is a disincentive to those of us who have been successful in securing grant funding and have accumulated these reserves to cover graduate student stipends, research costs, etc. She also wanted to ask, are you proposing that incoming new research faculty who are given startup packages will also be taxed the 2%? That might have a negative impact on recruitment. She goes on to say, taxing your faculty seems like an easy way to garner additional funding. What other more innovative methods are being proposed to fund projects and decrease the deficits, such as fundraising, lobbying the legislature, et cetera?
So we do all those things. I mean, we ended up with a 4% increase this year by lobbying the legislature and making our arguments over and over again. What would it be like? What if Mizzou weren't here? What if Mizzou medicine weren't here? What if all the things that we do every day for Missouri weren't here? Not to mention the fact that we employ 13,752 people. We're a major employer. We're an engine of innovation. We never let up on that, and we'll continue to. We had our best year ever this past year in fundraising. We did 19 cities in not even 3 months, almost as many weeks. And in November and December, we were on our way to a disaster in fundraising. So we turned that around. So to their point, that's why I guess I come back to this and say, it's 2%. It's not 20%. It's not 50%. It's 2%. The details of what we would do with startup packages, I think, are to be determined and thought through. Is that correct?
So right now, the way we would handle it is we would look at it at the college school division level. So across the university at that kind of high leadership level, we would make an assessment, and that set of leaders would be given their number, and then they would have to make an election of where they get the money from. So it's not a process of where every account across the whole campus would see a 2% amount pulled out of it. It would be that each of those areas of the university would receive their assessment. So this is how much 2% of all the balances held within your part of the university adds up to, and then we would ask them to tell us, where do you want to transfer that money from?
I would also just add that nursing traditionally is one of our top performing groups in terms of credit hours taught, in terms of dollars raised per faculty member. So I mean, they're in this mix there. Plant sciences is frankly one of the best and most well-funded in the country. So, you know, these are hard decisions to make, but we have to start somewhere.
Sorry, you didn't address the first point that she made, and I think it's really important, and that is, would beginning assistant or beginning professors, would their startup packages be taxed? I would think that would be a real disincentive to somebody coming in.
Those packages are all down in the schools and colleges.
Yeah.
And so we're not going to, at the campus level, try to figure out what every account is.
Okay.
We're going to take the balances across the whole college. We're going to take 2% against that number, and we're going to say to the dean, here's your number. So those dollars, to the extent that they're in one of the accounts under that dean, are going to be in the process, but how it would work out after that, what decisions that deans and others would make. So for my own division, very, very small division, am I gonna go take it from every part of my division? Probably not. I'm probably gonna look at a place where I have some set of resources, and I'll pay my part with that. But not everyone has much flexibility, so I can't predict how each leader is going to find their way to do that, but you know, we had lots of conversations. Should it be just something that hits every account? And we really feel that doesn't give leadership discretion. It doesn't allow people to say, well, here are places that we can't afford to create a disincentive, so here's how we're going to do that. Now, what we know is if we implement something like this, that puts a lot of pressure on those leaders, because there will then be a whole cadre of folks making their case as to why their account should not be involved in the process. So the only thing that I can say is when we look at something like this, and the comment said it seems easy, it is not easy to even consider asking folks to give us some of the money that they've put together. It's not easy, but it's also not easy to look at all the things that are facing our university and do nothing. We have, as an institution, tried numerous strategies, and so you've seen buildings on our campus get renovated, and that's because we've used a lot of different ways at trying to crack that. We're at a point in history where if we're going to help this university thrive into the future, as leaders we can't afford to say, well, that one is too hard to do. And we didn't go to this first. We have been doing fundraising for years. We have been working with the legislature for a very long time. And so one of the things that I think folks need to have some sense of is it's not uncommon in a structure where you have a lot of different entities for there to be something that needs to go to the overarching part of that entity so that it can keep the whole thing moving forward. If the way we currently are organized, everyone gets their money and it's their money, and there isn't a collective way that we move this university forward on very specific points. So, we've talked to folks at other universities. It's not uncommon for people to pull positions back from schools and colleges. We don't do that. The schools and colleges keep their positions and they make decisions. We believe that's a better model. It encourages people to think very carefully about which positions and very carefully about who you keep in them. If you pull positions that are vacant back, then it encourages people to keep people who may not be performing up to your expectations. So we're trying to have a blend of policies that help people see how they're supportive of the overall, but how they make their own part of the university thrive. And having that combination of policies is very complicated. But I very much have to say, I don't see this as an easy thing to do, and I know that the Chancellor does not see this as an easy thing to do. We're past our end time, so.
Thank you for coming. I could stay a few more minutes if any of you want to speak to me privately.